Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome back to my third live stream now. Thank you to those of you that have been here before and are coming back, as well as to anyone who is new. Yeah, when I first did this, I wasn't sure I was going to do any more ever again, but everyone seemed to be really up for it and got really involved in the chat, which was amazing. However, I was slightly concerned that just having to put up with me for too long would be incredibly boring. I'm going to mute my own version of me coming through my computer currently because that's annoying. But I'm joined by a very, very special guest today who has been up for being the first person to come on to the show as a guest and to be a bit of a guinea pig in that respect. The creator, writer, presenter, mastermind, I suppose, behind Step Back History, Mr. Tristan Johnson. Hello, Tristan. How are you?
Hello, friends. Hi. Yeah. Good. You covered up pretty much everything. Yeah, my name is Tristan Johnson. I'm a Toronto-based YouTuber who does Step Back History, which is a YouTube channel about history. And what else would I want to say? The sort of focus on showing how the past intercepts with the current general level of crises that are happening at any given time.
I think that's what I really love about your channel, and what I thought people would be interested in hearing a bit from you is that I think what you do really well is, as well as sort of presenting sort of factoids from history, which I also always love. I like there's something always great about learning about sort of hidden parts of history, is the way you also sort of like bring those to bear on the present in some way, whether that's a way of like looking at what might they tell us about the present, or thinking about how do we tell the story of history, what are the sort of politics of that as well, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, I noticed that I think when I was doing some background research when you had asked me to come on, and when I found out that you were doing a PhD in drama, I realized that when I write my videos, I actually do use like John Truby's like 22 steps of storytelling anatomy and stuff like that. So I've been making a conscious effort over the years to actually use the dramatic method and the and storytelling techniques to make things more compelling. And I think the best way to talk about things in the distant past is to make a strong visceral connection as to like why things are the way they are now, which I think is like one of the big appeals of history that we don't often give enough attention to.
Yeah, I think that comes across as well. I was thinking, one of your most recent videos, one of Tristan's most recent videos, he looked at sort of democratic establishment in the US and the sort of establishment of the establishment. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put that, but the sort of how that sort of has worked over the past sort of 50 years, I suppose, or so. Did you go back? But I think that you do sort of tell these stories really, really well, which seems really engaging, because it can be hard to sort of bring history to life in that way, I suppose.
Yeah, that was like one of the big issues I always had. Like when I was going to go start Step Back, I found that the status of history on the internet back then was essentially people who had literally ripped History Channel documentaries off of TV and put it on YouTube, or just these very long-winded, I don't want to be like too mean, but like very much like, here is battles that happened. Here are, here's the name of all of the generals and leaders and dates and like all the kind of stuff that I think makes most people come to the conclusion that they hate history. And I, as somebody who grew up in a kind of different context, like when I was raised by two history buffs myself, and my parents took me on a lot of road trips around the United States and Canada. And so like my experience of history is like going to actual places and talking to experts and that kind of stuff, like talking to a lot of history grad students who end up spending their summers like working at like, history tourist traps and stuff like that. And so I learned it in a way that was very different from like, say, your typical high school education. So I learned to appreciate it in a different way. And the way that it's taught in school is like almost designed to make people hate everything about it. And there's also another aspect which kind of plays more into the conversation that we're having today, which is that or if you're familiar, there's a province in Canada called Quebec,
Hmm.
which I know some people, because I went to university in Quebec, that I know some people who are becoming teachers, designed for teachers in that province, and the history curriculum description is like the teaching goals of the history curriculum are to make patriotic citizens and good consumers, which like says a lot about how history as a nation building project, rather than like,
Mm.
a field for learning about contextualizing our moment and things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I have also like I think what you're saying about battles. I was thinking like in the sort of history sphere on YouTube, I have noticed there's like a lot of like military history seems to dominate quite a lot. I want like, and part of that I wonder is the sort of internet often being a kind of slightly masculine space. I don't know, of like sort of that kind of wanting to do big wars and deaths and fights. But I think that's interesting what you're saying about that kind of the story of it, and also yeah, how does that lead into the present? I will quickly say, everyone, that I can see the chat. Thank you very much for popping in a bunch of uh, chat. Are they called? I don't know if they're called comments. If they're still, Tristan's very much more up on streaming than I am. I don't know if they're still called comments if they're in a chat. But thank you for all the chats. Uh, and yeah, much more just hype this time round rather than questions, which is cool. But if you do have any questions, thoughts, please do feel free to pop those in. Um, I mean, you're also talking about the sort of present crises, which we appear to have a lot of. We appear to have just like a whole bunch of things compounding, whether that's the sort of 2016 year where we had sort of crises of liberalism sort of kicking off.
Mm-hmm.
Hello Phoebe the cat. With sort of Brexit and with Trump, and now we have a global pandemic. Are you on lockdown there as well? Some form of quarantine?
Yes. Yeah. Ontario is in a state of emergency until the end of June at the earliest. So, yeah, we've gone rather hardcore. Not, I don't think as hardcore as the UK, but we're still like under the distinct instructions: do not go outside. You know, don't like everything. All the businesses are shut down, and like we don't have like you guys have like literal bobbies like there was like a whole joke about like feeling like a dastardly criminal for going for your second walk of the day or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, we don't have anything quite like that, but we do have like recommendations to only go outside once a day and only go shopping once a week and like that kind of stuff. So that's what we've been doing. I also live downtown in a very big city, so um, it makes it hard to really go for long walks because the streets are still kind of crowded.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose even with lockdown, even if only half the people are out, it's probably still pretty busy. I mean, in terms of talking about present crises and contextualizing them within the past. I mean, you've made like videos about Spanish flu and stuff as well. But yeah, what is your if you were to look back at the past for a moment that you think like informs? I don't know, might give us some context, explanation, or whether it's just the sort of societal feeling of it or the political stuff of where do we go from here. Would there be a point in time that you'd draw upon?
Oh, boy, do I have a lot to say on this because I'm literally, after this is done, I'm going to start working on a script for my next video that is basically on this subject. So there's a couple things to talk about. So the one thing first, as a historian, like making one of the first things that you learn in like history methods class and all that is the whole like things that sound axiomatic, like history repeats itself, is actually something that historians push back against, and that using the past to predict the present or to sort of make direct comparisons is not a thing that historians like doing because there's just too much context and there's too much like stuff to too many different details. But There are like you can take like small things to show how things were in the past, and if you want to, you can use that to inform and kind of think about ways to deal with situations. It's like constant like a big book of examples of like, well, this worked for these people. Um, as for what kinds of impacts we might see, well, the first things that come together, you can go with more recent examples. There's a really great book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine that I think speaks a lot to the kinds of things that we can expect politically from this moment. The Shock Doctrine's central thesis is that in these times of emergency, um, governments tend to use the state of shock, the state of like when people are in a disaster and they feel like they've lost all sense of context and a lot of like the political niceties have gone away and that's just about like survival, that governments tend to move in a direction of trying to rapidly pass through a lot of changes and reforms that they had lying around.
Mm-hmm.
The big examples you could think of was how the September 11th attacks led to the Bush administration rapidly pushing through a lot of reforms that clamp down on civil liberties, but also at the same time to push a war with Iraq that was completely unrelated, but it was something that was on like the neoconservative to-do list for a few decades. Or in Katrina, how the Katrina hurricane resulted in a rebuilding of New Orleans in like a very much like a neoconservative, neoliberal model. And they privatized a lot of industries that were public before the hurricane and things like that. So what you could see, and we have seen this already, for example, in Hungary, I don't know if you've seen what happened in Hungary recently, but Viktor Orban's government, which is already was like, circling around with weakening the liberal and democratic institutions in the country, have passed sweeping powers to the prime minister Viktor Orban and has more or less turned Hungary into a dictatorship just through this whole thing. And there was an attempt in Canada to pass a law which would give the prime minister a lot more power. That was summarily defeated because we're in a minority government right now, so it didn't get through. But like that's the kind of thing that one thing like politically to watch for is that the response to the crisis can very much come up as a attempt to push through ideas that might be highly unpopular or too extreme to go through in normal moments. As far as like the visceral experience, that part I reiterate a lot because I've been asked this question quite a bit, is sort of unprecedented. Like there have been plagues before, most notably like, for example, the one that occurred on your side of the Atlantic that wiped out like half of Europe or a third of Europe, where we saw long-term economic changes that were, basically killed the feudal system. But that was also the 1300s, and we don't necessarily live in the feudal system anymore. There was, or you can go with the pandemic of 1918, 1919. But that also was 101 years ago. So that also had we had different ideas of science back then. We had different ideas of the role of government in everyday life that were different back in 1919, and also that a lot of it was exacerbated because they didn't want to shut down industry. They didn't want to shut down the economy because they were literally still fighting World War I at the beginning of it. So all of those things together put it in a different context. And so when what do we do in this situation? I don't know. It's sort of it's this combination of things hasn't happened.
I think it's interesting the way that the weird way in which we're sort of all experiencing it together in a way that like just couldn't have happened before. That you're in Ontario, I'm in southwest England, but we were just talking then, and like a lot of the experiences are quite similar, and that through the internet we're sort of all isolating but still going through it all together, which is really weird. And I thought it interesting. Someone popped in the chat, and this was a point I was gonna make. I promise it was a point I was going to make. I'm not just stealing the idea from the chat. I mean, someone was talking about herd immunity. Initially, we did have a plan of the government's plan in the UK was initially that we were all going to develop herd immunity. We're all going to get coronavirus. Lots of people were going to die, but then we were going to be fine because we'd all have had it and got better. Even though we don't necessarily know that would have even have worked, even if we'd have been okay with everyone dying. But someone else is pointing to like the New Deal as well, and I think I've been thinking about it in terms of and the sort of post-war move towards sort of social democracy, essentially, in definitely sort of in the US, I believe, definitely in the UK. I don't know what the sort of post-war experience was in Canada, but it does seem like we're on a bit of a precipice between a shock doctrine scenario and a or that, but the particular place that the left is in, particularly after the last few weeks, definitely in the UK and the US. I don't know so much about the political circumstances in Canada, but does put the left on a bit of a back foot with regard to some of that stuff.
Yes, I think that very much this is a situation where because all of these major countries are run by right-wing governments, that in the short term they're going to get a boost by being the sort of like emergency time leader effect. But as the long-term effects of what we're going through start to seep in, I think we're going to see more of it. And as you pointed out, and this is something that also Naomi Klein talks about in her book, is that the shock doctrine doesn't necessarily mean to put through a bunch of neoliberal, neoconservative reforms, and that there are cases such as the Depression, such as the sort of massive rebuilding and debt crisis that happened in Europe that can result in also putting it's basically just a way to push through ideas that are floating around at the time. So because Europe had a strong, like, nascent social democratic movement that was building, they put it together. The United States didn't have that because they didn't have the same sort of crisis. World War II didn't create as much of a like devastating crisis as it did the rest of the world. Same with Canada. So our social democratic reforms came in slower over several decades and took a much longer period of time. Like, for example, our healthcare system didn't really come into effect until the 1960s. And America's famously never did at all. So
in fact, I was watching your video recently about when certain countries got some form of, like, whether it's like fully socialized healthcare or somewhere along some other form of universal healthcare. Obviously US does not, some other countries do not, but yeah, so that was interesting. I mean, I sort of seeing some of the emergency packages which have been introduced. It's certainly been interesting to think about. I think definitely in the UK, although obviously the sort of Labour Party and the sort of particularly the sort of Corbynite platform, Labour Party didn't win in December, but I do think that the pressure for more left-wing policy has shifted the conversation in a way that I don't know if the government would be like covering wages in quite the same way as they presently are. They've done a thing where, like, basically if you're employed in a employed job rather than being self-employed, you get your company can furlough you and then you get 80% of your wages. And I wonder whether some of that stuff would have gone through in quite the same way if those ideas hadn't been lying around, like you were just saying. I mean, there's that what's the Milton Friedman quote about when a crisis hits, the idea, someone will probably tell me in the chat in a second, but like when a crisis hits, it's the ideas that are lying around which matter, which was very much the thing of the late 1970s, 80s of sort of neoliberal revolution, was that the sort of Montpellier Society had been pushing those ideas for so long that they were around, and that when the OPEC crisis hit, that it was yeah, they were there to draw upon.
Yeah, and I think that showing that like UBI, for example, Universal Basic Income, which is sort of what they're experimenting with these relief programs, was an idea that was starting to make the rounds when this happened. But also, like to kind of talk to you, like this is where like I like the UK, for example, like as an example, you've had two elections in rather quick succession. Um, Relatively quick succession, and the fact that like you went from a barely being defeated Labour Party in 2017, which now like the evidence in the last couple of days shows that there was probably some shenanigans to blame for that, but also that the change in situation from 2017 to 2019 shows to me anyway that um, the crisis that you're going through with somebody deciding that leaving the one of the greatest supranational organization projects was somehow a good idea um, probably took over a lot of people's discussion. I could see that rebounding quite a bit in like future votes. Um, that's just my anticipation. That's just my guess. But I think that like what I'm talking the like long term effects that'll lead to a lot more agitation. Like if you think about the last crisis. I don't know how old you are, so I don't know how this all fits in. But with
27.
Okay, so you're probably you're probably in the right age range for when the 2008 recession hit real hard. Um, when that happened, the big backlash against it, like Occupy Wall Street and stuff like that, happened in like 2010. So it was a couple years later. And I think that in this crisis, right now, we're still in like crisis mode. We still literally can't go outside. But as the crisis passes, and as these temporary basic income programs or these temporary relief programs start to wind down, as like there was some attempts of like experimenting with giving Americans health care for the moment of the coronavirus. And then once that's over, like once these temporary programs go away and people realize, oh, my like subsidized income from my old job is gone, but now the company that I work for went bankrupt, and now the economy is in the shitter, and now it's a mess. Like that I think is going to be the moment where everyone's like, oh, but what about all those programs we had before? We seem to have enough money for that back then. Why don't can we do more of that, please? And I could see another wave of sort of left-wing resurgence coming out of that, very much like how Occupy Wall Street and that sort of left-wing progressive, for the American terms, like growth out of the 2008 crisis could sort of hit another wave, which, the last one, you could say that Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and them are part of that wave that came out of the 2008. Yeah. And I think that what we're about to experience is way, way worse than what happened in 2008.
I think it's interesting that I think Occupy is often I remember the sort of atmosphere. I wasn't like involved in any of the Occupy stuff, but I remember like the atmosphere around that, and then sort of how quickly it died off afterwards. And I remember sort of initially it very much seemed like a failure of sorts, right? It sort of happened, and then eventually the camps were disassembled or moved on, and the traction went. But it has been interesting seeing how much just the language has shifted. The language of those movements has still like permeates our political discourse, right? Like, I mean, Bernie Sanders is always on that like 1%, right? And that's like just part of our lexicon now, like as part of how we talk about the world. And so actually, it's interesting that I think it's so late in the game that in many ways the 2016 Sanders campaign and the sort of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership almost are a response to that financial crisis, which was so many years before. And I sort of wonder whether that's a result of it being the age that the generation that sort of come behind those movements might have been, that actually it's a coming of political age or whatever, when you can actually vote or you can get a bit more stuck in. But it's definitely interesting, in like you say, that took a bit longer than it literally being banks crashed, everyone went nuts, that it was a couple of years.
Yeah, I would say yeah. There's a couple points that you hit on that were pretty good. The generational thing. So, or the first on like language and class. Like in the UK, there's definitely a lot more of a robust discussion of class. Like class was still something that the haves and have-nots was still something that people in the UK talked about before the recession hit. It was, I mean, it was part of the reason why people were hesitant to publish Harry Potter originally, because they didn't want to publish a boarding school book because they thought it would appear to
Really?
yeah, it was one of the reasons why some publishers were like, I don't know about this Harry Potter thing. Like, posh kid going to boarding school doesn't seem like it would really fly in this day and age. Um, but like in America, that language was completely gone. There wasn't
Mm.
a there wasn't really like that concept of just how bad wealth inequality was. And health wealth inequality, if you look at like, because like I was politically active like way too young, so I remember stuff like the 2004 election where the U.S. is my area of expertise. That's why I talk about it a lot. That's like what I did my master's degree and stuff in. Um, so like in the 2004 election, class and like people like income inequality were not even subjects people thought about.
Mm.
Occupy Wall Street adding that like the 99% versus the 1% is something that only very marginalized people like Bernie Sanders, who were in the Senate and nobody paid attention to, talked about.
Mm.
And then Occupy and Occupy opened that up quite a bit. Canada's a bit different. We have a really, I wouldn't, it would take a while to go through, but Canada's got a uniquely weird political culture that would be it'd be hard to break down all the historical reasons. But
I was going to say,
the other
what's
thing,
what's the sort of left movement like, or the sort of parliamentary sort of left movement, or the extra parliamentary, but like in Canada, there was like was it the Green Party that were hoping to make gains, and then didn't in the last election? I might have totally misunderstood
we have a Green Party
context.
in Canada that has exactly a single seat in Parliament. They're uh, they are actually left. They're not. They're less of a left wing party in Canada than they are in other countries.
Okay.
They're kind of like a environmentalism plus like green capitalism type party.
Mm.
But our main parties are the Conservatives. Your typical Tories, your typical liberal, a Liberal Party, and a Social Democratic Party that goes by the name of the New Democratic Party, or NDP as they typically go by. And we also have got like, this will sound very familiar to you as a UK person. We also got a Bloc Québécois, which is a Quebec separatist or a Quebec nationalist party that that we thought was on the outs, but actually came back last year. Um,
Okay.
so we've got, what we have typically is we have an ostensibly left wing party, but it's very small, or I should say very small. It keeps about maybe 15-20% of parliament, but very, very often the oxygen for progressivism gets sucked out by the Liberal Party. And the Liberal
Mm.
Party is sort of this centrist party that um, says nice things that are progressive, but typically governs very right wing. And they suck up a lot of the oxygen out of both the Conservatives and the NDP. So fairly often, like I think something like 70% plus of Canadian history, we've been under a Liberal government. So it's like
Mm.
almost like a one party state.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting stuff happening, conversations going on in the chat. A little bit of just like Occupy nostalgia of like, oh, remember that? That was an interesting time, which I've been doing recently. Occupy London put out an album of like 12 songs or something, of like, and it was amazing. I loved it, and I can't find it for the life of me anywhere on the internet now. But it had just some amazing tracks on it. But also some conversation. I mean, there was some conversation about those Labour leaks. So what you were talking about a moment ago, we were talking about the. So for those of you that are not up to date on this particular minutiae of left-wing UK politics. There was a report which was leaked a few days ago, which sort of made some. I suppose we have to talk about them as allegations. I don't know what the. I don't think we're likely to suddenly get our doors busted and arrested, but surrounding whether some of the sort of employed staff at the top of the party, so not well, I think there was some sort of politicians involved as well, but mostly sort of employed staff at the top of the party who had tried to undermine attempts to win the 2017 election by like just making things bad, in particular around the sort of anti-Semitism controversy and sort of nuking some of the investigations that were meant to be happening so that it would look even worse. And I suppose that sort of comes back to some of the stuff you're talking about in your establishment video, right? That idea of the sort of nominal, it's much less left-wing in the US. I'm not sure what the descriptor for the Democratic Party would be, but the idea of sort of there being some sort of coalesced power at the top of that, which is actually able to, like you were saying with the NDP, potentially ensure that left-wing policies and platforms don't get taken forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that also you also talked a little bit about generational stuff, and I do think that there is a definite impact of the like a generation of millennials who grew up in a time of relative prosperity as children, and then as soon as they entered adulthood had everything taken away, and like walked into like an economic hardship, and so like our entire adult life has been associated with economic hardship. And it's like that sort of thing results in us. I think that results in sort of the way that a lot of this movement has energy. And I think that as more millennials get involved in government and things like that, that we'll see some definite shifts, because right now society is still run largely by baby boomers who grew up with their youth and adult life and middle age, like basically every single phase of their life being part of being economic prosperity all the time for them all the time. And that leads to a different type of thinking.
Because even post 2008, the system has still worked in their favour, right? The rescue packages looked after people who already owned homes, in doing so making homes even more expensive than they already were. I think that generational thing's really interesting. I've been thinking a little bit lately. So I've made a few videos on my channel where I've looked at books and sort of theorists that have that were writing in the late 1960s, and within doing that, the sort of events of 1968 come up a lot. Whether that's the like full-on uprisings in France, whether that's the sort of anti-war stuff in America, and is that also civil rights? I'm not sure. History is not my.
1968 was the year where Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Okay, so it was that period as well, and very much like anti-Vietnam as well. And thinking about actually how much that sort of relates to the present day, although the tactics are very different, right? That was very much street movements, protests, occupations, whereas although in the early 2010s it did feel as though there was a bit of that. Actually, as we've gone through the decade, it's been electoral politics. But the way that it's a generational shift in both the experience of the world and the way of viewing the possibilities of how we can govern the world, I don't know, it's felt like a really interesting, there's some correlations there which are interesting.
Mm-hmm. The student movement, like, I mean, if I were to make some distinctions, young people during that time, especially those who were in higher education, were in a better position than a lot of people who are the same age now. Like back then, you worked a part-time job during the summer, you could afford your tuition, and you were fine for university. So you had a lot of time to, go around the country and protest. While a lot of people that age today are like six figures in debt and coming out to a really harsh job market that pays comparatively much less than it did today. Like somebody with a high school diploma could make comparatively what would be about a uh, $60,000-$70,000 a year job in modern day money right out of high school.
Yeah.
Just as like an example. So the sort of relative poverty plus like massive amounts of debt has an impact of reducing people's ability to be politically active, because when you don't have that much economic stability, you really can't focus on much other than your immediate surroundings.
I think it's interesting you say that there's the thing of the crisis seems more apparent because it hits more people, and it's just more obvious that you clearly have a lot less money than previous generations have had. But yeah, I think like you're saying, that just the amount of time you have is so limited to get involved in whatever thing it is you want to whatever cause it is you want to do something about. There's probably some something interesting in. I'm pretty sure it was in your establishment video where you talk about sort of the way that some of those things were folded back into the or the way the sort of Democratic Party worked in the US worked to sort of either fold in some of that energy or to just completely squash it out, which does perhaps have some relation to the generational politics of today, where the voting split in terms of generations has been like quite stark, I think, in many different countries, but that there's still a lot of boomers, right? Like you were saying a moment ago, there's still a lot of boomers, and they're still in all the positions of power, and also that kind of some of that Gen X generation who are kind of like Thatcher's children and of like or Reagan's children, or whoever the appropriate politician in whichever country is.
And they're talking about like this generation, like there's actually like stories, and I'm sure this is much less of a surprise in the UK because of like how stark Thatcherism was, that like there was a period in the 80s when like, the boomers were in their 20s or whatever, where you had this younger generation that was far more conservative than their parents were. That were that kind of stuff. But yeah, the fact that I'm trying to remember, but Labor conservative in 2019 was very much on generational lines. Like when the marginals that went from Labor to Tory were very much places where a lot of old people live. The Brexit vote was very much on age line, if I remember correctly, too.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at the Democratic primaries that just sort of, entered into the less energetic phase, that Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders, like in some states, even though Joe Biden would win a state, he lost every single demographic under 40, and in some states he lost every demographic under 50, and yet still won because the old people don't have they don't have jobs because they're pensioners or they're retirees or whatever word you want to use. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to convert my Canadian, American, British terms so that they all work. I was reminded of that when I was watching one of your videos before we started about caravan parks, and I was like, it's trailer park? Like, okay. Anyway.
Yeah, we don't. We would caravan park rather than trailer park. And yeah, we'd use them as a. Although, like, there are examples. There was a guy I went to school with who lived in a caravan park, but like, there is. It's interesting, some of the word, but we do have retirees.
Yeah.
That is a word we use.
Okay. So yeah, like retirees and people who have people who are on the older end and later in their career, so they have more free time and more ability and flexibility where they work. So they could take all the time in the world to go vote, while people who are wrangling two kids while also bouncing between two jobs don't exactly have time to go line up in a poll for several hours so they can go vote. And at the same time, all the polling locations in the United States anyway, that were in those locations where those people might vote, a lot of them were stripped away. So sometimes, I don't know if you saw this, but like in some of the big primary states like Texas and California, they had one polling location, like for example, they had one polling location for all of UCLA, which is like one of the largest universities in the United States. So
Wow.
they had people who were lining up to vote for 8, 9, 10, 11 hours. And it got to the point where some Bernie Sanders supporters actually started a small charity to mass buy pizza to
Oh,
take to these
right.
people who are waiting in line for
Yeah.
basically an entire day so that they could vote.
Yeah.
And yeah,
First thing I want to do is say someone in the chat just made the joke. Oh, where's it gone? Street protests, yet another industry that millennials have killed, which I enjoyed, and I felt it was important. You knew that I enjoyed that joke, but also I wonder how much geographical or spatial inequality plays in that as well, or particularly the ways that sort of the future facing jobs are conglomerating in certain areas in the world. Like in each country, there is probably one or two cities where the tech jobs are, or the broader sort of jobs that younger people would like to do, and how that means that. And that's before you even get into the fact of like university towns or university cities where everyone's going there to who can afford to at least going there to study, and how that plays into it of the fact that if it is a generational divide, which I think we take the mick out of the idea of a cultural war quite a lot, but it does actually often feel like it is like that. It's just different ways of viewing the world. I wonder, how much because that just stacks up votes in certain places. So you do get areas which have been deprived of like investment I suppose investment in multiple different ways, whether that's infrastructure or whether that's like in terms of having places that can employ people, in a way that means that everyone gets if you're younger and want some kind of sustainable future, you have to move out, and whether that means that it's just stacking votes up in certain places.
hmm and the financialization of houses and homes also results in a lot of those places having like comically overinflated prices for
Mm.
houses and homes. Like, for example, San Francisco, the home of basically all of the large major tech companies in the US, has like famously like ridiculously expensive houses. Um, I live in downtown Toronto, and Toronto also is infamous for how expensive its homes and
Mm.
how expensive its apartments are. Like, I think I remember remembering that like my parents' house versus when they bought it in like 1992 or 1993 versus how much it's valued now has increased by like almost 20 times, like 20 times the price.
Wow.
And
There's a book. I've not read there's a Grace Blakely book on financialization, which I've got coming in the post at the moment, but I'm looking forward to reading that. I think that one of the interesting ones is I don't know if I've not read it all because it is ridiculously long, but I've read the introduction and got the sort of synopses of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which very much looks at the idea of it's sort of interesting in that in relation to like Capital critique on volume one, it is it is not so interested in class, and maybe we'll come back to that point because I know everyone in the chat was loving the chat about our conversation about sort of the language of class, but very much doesn't look at class in that way of like either owning classes and working classes, or ruling classes, like or the more sort of late 20th century ideas surrounding like cultural capital, social capital, economic capital. It very much just goes like, actually, if we look at it, it's just about whether you have some form of it's more about the rate of return on capital in comparison to GDP rather than the difference between what you bring in from a working job and the difference in labor value, etc. Which is really interesting. He just looks at to Thomas Piketty, the French economist, just looks at the idea of actually, if the growth of a country, which is always a bit of a fiction in many regards, but like if the growth of a country is X%, that throughout history, the growth of the value of capital, so buildings or factories or film rights these days and stuff like that, but is always greater than that, and that means that if you own that stuff, you're gonna be richer, and that has played into a lot of those generational divides, I think, because there must be like a year in which if you were born one side of it, you're much more likely to own property than someone who is the other side, someone born the year later. In terms of the sort of language of class thing, because I know everyone in the chat was loving that, there's definitely, I think that thing about like home ownership is quite interesting. I've got a video I want to work on at some point in the near future where I want to sort of look at changing discourses and change around in class, and also changing like formation surrounding class in terms of, I think, even when we see, you were saying that in the UK we do talk about class in a way that perhaps in America and maybe in Canada that it doesn't get spoken about so much. But I think for quite a while, even when we do talk about class, we talk about it in this kind of like aestheticized way, whereby being working class is wearing a flat cap, and it is working in a mine, and it is it's not liking avocados, and it's all the stuff, that the cultural stuff that exists around it, rather than how much you earn, etc., what capital you have. But in terms of the actual economics of it, there's a sort of study that someone did in 2013, a group of sociologists did, where they looked at the idea that actually in the present day there's quite a big portion of working class people who, because they bought houses at the right time, you can actually be a homeowner and be working class in a way that actually, if you can come from quite a wealthy background and be living in London, and although you're renting, you're still in class terms far further up the ladder than the person that owns a house, but it's somewhere perceived as shit.
That makes sense. I guess like the way I was referring to it was like in your political discourse. Like, for example, from what I picked up about the way that you guys talked about when the Grenville fire happened, the way that you talked about, the way that like media talked about it, and the way that people talked about it was, maybe it's only because I only follow, all the British people I follow are leftists or something, but the way people talked about the Grenville fire, like it went to class a lot faster than, like, if it happened in America, they would say thoughts and prayers followed by like, is there something that we can bomb to fix this? Like, is there like they would have probably, like in America, for example, if the Grenville fire had happened, they would have talked more about like, because class and race are so much more linked in America, like they would have talked a lot about like how it was the tower, like if a Grenville in America would have had a lot more people of color living in it, and they would have talked about it more on racial lines, like just as an example.
There's definitely in this slightly more reactionary discourse, and particularly around Brexit, so class played into definitely the conversations after Brexit, as well as the conversation leading up to it, but where sort of class and race did become really embroiled, where in the way it was talked about in the media, to be working class was also to be white. Like that was sort of two things. It was sort of something different if you're a person of colour. Like that was not quite the same. It wasn't like the good, honest British working class. But I think I'm increasingly interested in actually how much does that term track on to our present experience. Like it often feels like the term working class is built around like a sort of industrial proletariat, right, of the industrial, living in Manchester after they've invented the cotton mill, rather than a present like gig economy worker or call center operator. I think it's interesting. I wonder how, because I think in many ways, like the editor of, there's a British magazine called the Tribune, which is basically the sort of sister publication of Jacobin in the US, and the editor wrote a piece actually for Jacobin, I think, about the end of the Bernie Sanders campaign and the use of like class language, and what was the point I was going to make? And talking about it sort of making a comeback. But I wonder, like, I don't know, whether there's new terms that relate to the present. But there's something about the term working class which feels like you want to own it in a way that something like precariat, right, which is one of the like possible sociological replacements, doesn't sound like there's something about working where you're like, okay, I do work, right? There's something inherently honourable almost about like the term, which makes you want to claim it in a way that being like, hi, I'm precarious, you're like, I don't want to be that, thank you. Like, that sounds like an insult.
Yeah, I would say, although like, is there like, I'm trying to think of like strong redeeming qualities of being like a like gig economy worker, or like a precarious contract 0 hour contract worker. Like it's a generation of people in a working class that is defined by the fact that they can lose their job at literally any moment, and basically associated with absolutely zero benefits that were typically associated with employment in the past.
Mm. Yeah, because there was in the past, wasn't there? There was real like your labor value is being you're not getting the full terms your labor value, but you have a job for a long time, or at least in the sort of in the sort of social democratic period of the Trente Glorieuses, is it in French? The sort of like
Trente Glorieuses, yeah.
That's the only clever sounding thing about history I know, is the phrase Trente Glorieuses. In that period that you're still. I mean, there's a guy called Mark Fisher who everyone's already done their weekly love-in for in the chat.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, yeah. Who talks about like the idea of like hauntology, and the idea after the sort of late 1970s of Thatcher Reagan neoliberal revolution, the way in which people looked back still to that period as a period of progress, and not necessarily loving the not necessarily like as a way of loving social democracy, but loving what it felt like that was leading to. And it does feel that things are so different now in terms of our relationship to our employers, or like I have very rarely had an employed job where I didn't at least have to I do some university teaching, and even there, although I do the teaching every week and it's always the same time, I then have to log onto a system and go, yes, I did work at this time that I said I would, and that I'm going to and there is very much that there's no kind of family of the company in the sense that people often used to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like for example, just to give like a contrast, my dad went to a job fair in his last year of university and met with a company. They hired him on the spot, and he worked for that exact same company until this very moment.
Wow.
And that was, and my dad is in his early 60s now. So just like that was it. Like previously you would get a job and then you'd do that job for decades, and then you would retire, move to Florida, and have 2.3 kids and die. But like now, like for example, not only is every job precarious because you're on a contract, which means that they can really tear it up at any given time, but also if it ends and you don't get your contract re-upped, then that means that you're almost always kind of looking for a job at any given moment. And the only real way to get promoted and to move up in whatever you're doing, So any way to like kind of have that economic upward mobility is to find a new job, because like no one just gets promoted anymore.
Yeah, you
And
don't get your year on year 3% or whatever.
yeah, and if anything, like then because everybody's so precarious and everyone's moving around from contract to contract, there's a lot more competition for every single job, which means prices can be made lower because it's a buyer's market, and um, what they offer can get lower and lower because people are just always desperately looking for something different, because they know that whatever they have now is only temporary, and that leads to a downward pressure on pretty much every metric of a satisfying career and a satisfying life. And without that kind of stability, there's the whole thing about like, why aren't millennials having children? It's like, this is the exact reason why.
Yeah, it's expensive and there's no security, right? I mean, I like some of it must be cultural, I suppose, in a sense of even if you told some people that they were going to work at the same place for 60 years, some people, or maybe not 60 years, no, you'd be like 80, wouldn't you? But like, if you're going to work the same place for like 40 years, some people, like I think a lot of people these days would be like, that sounds awful. Like I hate the sound of that. Whereas 30 years ago, people would have gone, great, security, safety, and some of that is, although that cultural aspect I think comes through that like neoliberal mindset of like, you're going to be successful and you're going to do everything and you're going to take on the world and win, and then some of it, and it sort of straddles the line, I think, between the economic aspect and that more like cultural aspect, which sits alongside it. Which I mean is lots of the conversations that people are having in the chat at the moment, around if we talk about class a lot in the sense of like economics, but like someone saying that, yeah, we're talking about class economically, but what about cultural class? Even though I'm economically working class, I have a university degree, how does that change the landscape? And I think stuff like that's really interesting. It's sort of hard to answer in a sense. I mean, Pierre Bourdieu is the man to read on that. But the ways in which those things often play into each other, and I think some people would say, I don't know what your take on this, Tristan, is. Some people are very much like, they've read their basic Marx and are like all about the, it's all about the relationship to the means of production. Some people are like, maybe it's a thing of how much money do you have in the bank. How much others will say, yeah, all that cultural stuff is super, super important. I don't know what your take on this is, Tristan.
I mean, it's all connected in different ways. When it comes to like education, for example, honestly, like with the way that we value education in our day and age, that the difference between a working class person and a working class person with a PhD is how much debt you're in and how fancy the books you read are, like for the most part, because now you're just gonna like, and also there's sort of an inflation that has been associated with that too. Like Canada, I think it's one of the most highly educated countries on earth. I think it might be, if not the most highly educated country on earth. But what that results in is like you need a degree to get like even like a basic entry level job. And that there is something to that aspect, but like, I don't know. I know so many people who are highly educated who then like went on to like, do the same Starbucks job that they would have done if they had just, gone to work right after high school. So,
I mean, that was
I don't like
the sort of educating your way. I'd say in the UK, although there has been a sort of consistency to us talking about class. I think that in the period of like the sort of long 1990s, you're aware of that sort of idea of like the sort of 89 or the 89 to 2008 at the very least, where it was all about education. It was all about what's referred to as like social inclusion models of making people less poor. That's not very well worded, but like, so rather than trying to improve life for all working class people. It's about providing people with like the rope out, the opportunity out, which has all its problems because it requires a lot of people to fail to get out. But that was very much for a while was like, well, we're gonna open up university education to more people than have previously been able to access it. But which I think which had a similar effect to I think you were talking about then about now you just need to have a degree to get the job that previously you didn't need to have a degree to do. So there's that aspect of like inflation in that sense of like educational inflation. But I do also think that the cultural aspects play quite a large role. Like I didn't grow up super poor, but like came from like a what in Mike Savage's social class in 21st century I'd probably describe as like a traditional working class background where you own the house and you're probably mostly safe from everything going tits up, but don't have a huge amount of access to stuff. And I often find like just being in university spaces, there's like things that feel like it's hard to explain, but like things like where the conversation suddenly turns to like skiing or something, and although you can sort of take part in that conversation, you're a bit like, oh, I have no idea what to say. So I end up just taking the mick out of everyone, which goes down one of two ways. But so it's kind of yeah. I think the way in which the cultural stuff also plays a role, even if it's like those really subtle roles of like just making certain people feel less comfortable in certain spaces. Yeah, I think the intersection between the two of them is really interesting. Although ultimately it does come back to money, right? It's whether you can have afforded to go skiing at some point. People are talking about in the chat about the sort of that these days you can also educate yourself on the internet, which hopefully both of us do some part in helping people to do. But I think that's interesting because but at the same in the same breath, so much of it's actually about the qualification, isn't it?
Yeah, very much like the piece of paper. Like I can't tell you how many, as a TA, I'm sure you've done this before too, how many times you've taught a student who, despite not earning a grade, asking for one because they needed the qualification to get into another school. Very often, I remember I taught some students who were trying to get into the business school at our university who would basically say, hey, I need a higher mark on this because I need to get this number so that I can get into business school. And this is like, oh God. Yeah. Like the value of a lot of this thing has been completely lost. And I do think that, like there's probably some downriver, effects of, being the most highly educated, person working at the office, because you end up being like weird and standoffish. And then, people don't, then you don't get the water cooler, which then that's sort of the weak connections that actually advance you in your career in a lot of ways. And I had that experience. I used to work at a nonprofit, and I think that while it was mostly lawyers and I was the resident not lawyer, that kind of kept me out of the office culture in quite a large way, and that could have had impacts on how my career moves went and such. But I think that that's just like one example. I think that the number one example is race and gender and whether you're LGBTQ plus and like all those kinds of things has huge impacts on what your future opportunities will look like, and not for the good. And it's and that is like, this is like I'm participating in a panel on April 20th about intersectionality and class reductionism and stuff like that. And it's like, these are also aspects to understand about the myriad ways that we are, royally screwed over in our ways to try and build a life for ourselves. Because as we move towards a more precarious economy, and as we all are competing more and more for, like as we're fighting more and more for fewer and fewer chairs on the musical chairs thing, um, the people who are marginalized because they're immigrants, because they have they're LGBTQ plus, they're women or people of color, like all of those things uh, will hurt them even more.
Mm.
And like without talking about all those things as if they are connected aspects, and that like a poor white cis heterosexual man and a poor black gay woman are going to have very different prospects and even their ability to try and build a life for themselves.
Yeah, and I think over the past few years, there's occasionally been that tide of like, I mean, yeah, sort of class reductionism rising, and I think we've hopefully managed to squash it every time it's sort of reared its head a little bit. Because I think yeah, everything you're saying there is correct. Like I know I get it in comments to videos and in chats sometimes as well, where it's like, well, actually, isn't it all about class? I think it's just impossible to talk about I don't want to use the term social justice, but like, or economic justice, or any of that kind of like to talk about inequality, I suppose, without reference to gender, to sexuality, to race, and also I don't think I'd want to be part of a movement that was trying to sort, I don't know, trying to just sort, like obviously in some respect I would suggest that sorting out the economic stuff would also sort out some of that stuff, but some of the solutions are slightly closer in the other stuff. But yeah, I wouldn't want to be any part of something that wasn't drawing everyone along. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and also it shows that if you like fighting for one of those causes should, in your mind, like in
Mm,
every ways, like fighting for women's rights is a fight for
yeah.
overall economic equality because you are making more economic equality possible. And it does show that if you see movements that try and advance one of these things and actively suppresses acknowledging that these are all connected, then that's something to watch out for. That's like I think that like that's sort of the big critique that comes up of like what I think is being called like liberal feminism as an example.
Mm,
The
mm,
idea of like or like girl boss, I guess, is another word that would be used, or lean in feminism, like that kind of thing, where it is like it is a fight for gender equality, but for a very privileged few, and does it at the expense of other people, and not acknowledging that this is all like if you are going to fight for women's rights, you have to fight for women of color's rights, queer women's rights, and poor women as well as like as everyone else. Like you have to like all be in it together, or
mm,
else yeah we're going otherwise because and that is also fighting a capitalist impulse because capitalism likes to box things in neat categories that they're marketable, and it's easier for us to um, advance just one cause and move that forward because then it's small enough that it can be easily stamped down and forgotten about while you really need to be like building something together.
I mean, someone saying in the chat that about I've always viewed Rory. Hello, Rory. Has said I've always viewed class as a relation to the mode of production as opposed to identity. I don't see a real conflict between class and identity politics. I think there's some truth to that in the sense of like that there's not a conflict. I don't think there's a conflict between the two at all. In fact, I think much like Tristan saying, I point that will have a benefit for working class women, right? If we could get free childcare, because women are primarily the sort of primary carers in most countries, then the people that are probably gonna benefit most from that are working class women. Although uh, although I would critique, I would argue a little bit with the idea that there's not identity elements to class as well. It's been interesting. I think I was been thinking in all of the live streams that I've done, some of the like themes that have come up. It's interesting the way a theme tends to exert itself. Although there's also been a side conversation happening in the chat about IQ or something, and Stefan Molyneux, and everyone maybe taking and him being an illiterate weirdo or a con artist. But the conversation that we've been having has seemed to sort of theme itself around this, not only the issue of class, but also the I don't know, the material politics and material history and sort of the cultural elements, and how do those two things overlap or intersect or inform each other. I mean, maybe that would be useful to take forward to some of your roundtable on the 20th. Where is that, so people can find it if they want to?
It's going to be on the Punk Sci Twitch channel, and it's going to be me and Lumiru, who is one of the like biggest non-binary Twitch streamers, who talks a lot about gender and sexuality on their platform, and also Andre Demise, who is a very influential contributing editor for one of Canada's most prominent magazines, and also is like is a Twitch streamer in and of himself, and writes and talks a lot about race, especially in relation to the Afro-Caribbean experience, which is his own background. I think he's Jamaican, I believe. So he talks a lot about like that kind of thing. So it's going to be, and then somehow I'm in that, and I don't know why, but I am. So that's going to be rather wild.
I'm sure you can bring some perspective. Like I've got a video coming up that I'm working on. I'm looking at essentially. So I do a series called What the Theory, where I do look at ideas from people, and I'm currently vaguely working on one on sort of Judith Butler and gender performativity. And sort of as part of some of my research for that, I was watching your video on sort of gender throughout history and in different cultures. I think that was really the way you managed to use your sort of broad knowledge, sort of survey knowledge of different cultures, and sort of draw out a lot of the stuff was really interesting, and particularly of a way of being able to go, look here at this sort of social system. So I'm sure you'll bring that to it.
Yeah, the idea that that video was a fun one to make, because gender is if there's one thing to take away from that video, and one thing that like historians could, to really bring it back to the fundamental question that we kind of started the stream with, if there's like a thing to like, what kind of stuff can history teach you about how you experience our modern moment, is really understanding that a lot of the things that we think of as being these immutable ancient ideas that have been part of our society for time immemorial are actually not that. Things that you think are really old are actually not that old, and things that we think are innate to our nature actually aren't. But also that ideas that we think are novel or are ahead of their time are also very old. The struggle for racial equality is centuries old. The struggle for income inequality, or the struggle against income inequality, is one of the oldest struggles of humanity. Like, all of these things is like it's a way to show that that a lot of things can be changed, and a lot of things are not as it's not as fatalistic as people think it is, I guess, is like a way to
I think about that quite often, about how do we encourage others to sort of view the present as historical, right, as contingent and as changeable, and all of that. Like, how do we, because often, like you say, we think that everything's happened and that like this is the end point. I think even beyond the sort of Fukuyama stuff, I think people have possibly often seen themselves as like history led up to this and this is the end bit. And yeah, how do we actually view the present as historical and as changeable? I think is really interesting.
Yeah, in a history, like in a seminar course, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, seminar course is like the grad school level where you meet up once a week, you read a book, and then you talk about it for 3 hours. And if anyone sort of makes an argument like that, it's called out as being quote unquote teleological, which is a multiple syllabic way of saying like um, treating something as if all of it was leading towards this current moment, and that this current moment is not just like another part in ongoing processes, which is, I think, a common trap that people fall into just because I think of the way that our brains seem to like to gravitate towards crafting narratives about how we got to where we are today. That seems to be like the primary way that our brain understands where it is and how it works. So much so that when things happen that are shocking and sudden and sort of break that idea of knowing how we got to where we are now, you could almost define that as the definition of things like trauma and post-traumatic stress and those kinds of things as like or shock as a concept. It's like breaking down, like just having that loss of connection, I guess.
There's a lot of conversation in. I mean, I think there's a slight delay between when we talk and when it comes out, but also obviously the chat for people to think up their amazing responses to what we're talking about, and a lot of conversation actually about like commonalities between, like, if you're white working class dude, you actually have more in common with someone who is a person of color who is possibly slightly well off, but I mean, I'm not trying to make the Green Book case here, but that there is, there are commonalities in, although the means of oppression are slightly different. You have a lot in common due to the way that you are marginalised or oppressed in some way. In fact, I don't know if you've seen, Tristan, the film Pride.
I haven't. Sorry.
You haven't? Okay. This might interest you as a history person. So there's a film, it's an independent UK film, which came out a few years back, which is about the miners' strike in the UK. And it's about a group who are called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, who were a group of LGBT people who lived in London and were based around a gay bookshop in London, who sort of started to recognise that the way that the miners were talked about by Thatcher and sort of working class rural communities that lived around those mines were talked about in the papers was quite similar to the ways that they were spoken about, and the sort of those two groups coming together. So all these like white working class people out in the countryside and all the out in Wales, I think it's Wales they go to, and and these LGBT people living in central London sort of forming this common bond over. And I mean, the actual historical story is also like just absolutely beautiful. Like, because like a lot of those working class communities were very, uncertain about LGBT people. Like, this was the unknown. And in the end, the National Union of Mine Workers was like a key force in pushing the Labour Party to support like various forms of gay rights, and the I can't remember what year it is, Pride March was led by this mine. Like, lots of mines in the UK used to have like brass bands which existed around them. Like, you did your mining in the day, you did your brass band playing in the evening, and they led like the Pride March a few years later. The whole story is beautiful, but it's really interesting, just story about finding those commonalities, I suppose.
Makes sense to me.
Cool.
That does sound pretty cool.
It's good. Worth checking out if you can. I mean, that brings us, I feel like we came back to a nice circular point at the end there. In which case, I might start to wrap this up. I'm sure you'd like to get some. It's lunchtime where you are, isn't it? Roughly. So
Yeah,
you might like some
I'd
lunch. I might like some dinner.
got a lot of stuff to do before Tristan can go to sleep tonight. So,
Yeah.
um,
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being up for this, for being game, for joining in. It's been absolute pleasure. I mean, it's flown by. It is.
yeah,
It's been great. So thank you so much. Yeah, if you guys, if any of you aren't already aware of Tristan's amazing work, I'm sure many of you will be. But you can find him on Step Back History. When's a new video coming out? When?
week from Friday.
Didn't mean that was out of interest. That wasn't like new video
Well,
now.
yeah. No, there's what's it called? There's a sponsor, so there's a very definite
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
What's it called? February? No, we're in April now. April 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So that's like the time.
But
And
have
if
to
that
be
doesn't
that
happen,
specific.
I'm in a lot of trouble.
Okay.
But yes, Tom, this was a really great talk, and I had a really good time hashing out ideas with you. It was great.
Cool. Thank you very much. And I'm going to say a quick goodbye to everyone over here. I've not used this camera at all, but thank you so much for tuning into the stream once again. I'll leave it up for a couple of minutes so people can say goodbye to each other and finish off the amazing conversations you've been having down in the chat. But yeah, you can check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel, patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Tristan also has a Patreon. What's your Patreon, Earl?
Patreon.com/stepbackhistory.
Cool. We both managed
If
to
you're
get
so
in
inclined.
quickly then, and to get our our actual channel titles as our Patreon, which is good. But cool. Thank you all so much for joining. I've been Tom. This has been Tristan. Have lovely evenings, afternoons, and stay safe. Now I've got to work out and remember how to turn this off. It's there. Thank you, everyone.